We'll do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chof Hey, the second Sicha for Parshas Lech Lecha. It's a very lumdish, intricate, detailed Sicha in which the Rebbe explains the Rambam in the end of the laws of Mila, discussing the greatness of Mila, and in comparing this to the Mishnah and the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is the sources of the Rambam and the changes that the Rambam made over there. And it talks about, the Rebbe will explain that there is actually two levels in the level of Bris Mila. One is that it's part of the general covenant of the Jewish people with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A bris is a covenant, and that's a connection, and that's a general idea of bris. And then it has the very specific laws of the actual bris, and that will answer why the Rambam brings this. Plus, some psukim and the other psukim, as we'll see in detail in the Sikha. We're learning Lilu Nishmas, Rav Levi Yitzchok ben Chaim Tzvi, Ten Nishmosi Tzurur B'Tzurur HaChaim. And we'll go step by step. So we'll look inside. So in the end, Aleph, in Soif Hilchas Milah, so this is in the end, after the Rambam writes all the laws of Milah, in the end of the laws of Milah, Firt ois der Rambam wegen der Meile von Mitzvahs Milah. So the Rambam concludes over there the specialty, the greatness of the mitzvah of circumcision. And the Rambam brings down that kol mitzvahs ha-Torah, all the mitzvahs of the Torah, nichresu aleihem sholosh brisos. They were formed for them three covenants, which means we find in the Torah three covenants that connect and obligate us between us and the Eibishter. So meaning that all mitzvahs, there is two covenants to encourage us and to tell us the importance of all the mitzvahs, that we make a covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the mitzvahs. That's by all the mitzvahs. A total of three. Shenemar. And then the Rambam brings the verses in which it talks in the Pasuk about the covenant between Hashem and the Yidden through the mitzvahs. But when it comes to the in the Torah where it says Koros Bris, but when it comes to circumcision, says the Rambam, there are 13 covenants. Valamila nichresu shloish esrei brises. There are 13 covenants that were formed for circumcision. That mitzvah of circumcision has 13 times covenants. Im Avraham Avinu, with Avraham our father. When you look in the parsha of the end of Lech Lecha, where the Eibishter tells Avraham to circumcise, it says brisi and brisi again and again. So there are 13 brises with Avraham Avinu. And the Rambam brings down, it says, Ve'etno brisi beini ubeinecha. So that's the verse which starts off the parsha of the Bris Milo, and the Eibishter is saying to him, "Ve'etno brisi beini ubeinecha," and then Urechem Tois, then he enumerates alle brises, all the covenants that we find over there, bis ves brisi okim es Yitzchok, until the final one, my bris, I will set up with Yitzchok. which is the final covenant. Those are the 13 covenants from the pasuk that the Rambam brings down. So what do we see over here? That the mitzvah of Bris Milah has 13 times covenants. All other mitzvahs only have 3. So this is the greatness of the mitzvah of Milah over all mitzvahs. So where is this source? As Milah is nichrusu aleho shloish esrei brises. The source that Milah have been formed 13 covenants is Mekoyre the Kesef Mishnah Tzeichen is the source, as noted by the Kesef Mishnah. The Mishnah Soif Perigimul the Nedorim. The Mishnah in the 3rd chapter of Nedorim. Over there it says Gedoyla Milo Shenichrusu Aleho Shloish Esrei Brisos, that Milah is great because there were 13 covenants, brisos, formed with it. The Torah says 13 times bris. But the Rebbe wants to show how the Rambam differs than the Mishnah. The Rebbe will explain some of the differences, but then the Rebbe will be left with something to ponder why. The Rambam is over Meisif of Loshun HaMishnah. The Rambam adds to the language of the Mishnah. He says, Aleph, as the Yud Gimel Brisis Nichrusu im Avram Avinu. He says that they were formed with Avram Avinu. The Mishnah doesn't say with Avram. It said there's 13 covenants for Milah, but not that the covenant was with Avram Avinu. That was formed. And the Rambam adds with Avram Avinu, which later on will explain the Rebbe's explanation. We'll see why that adds, why that helps. Beis is mefaret the Allah Yud Gimel Brisis. The Mishnah doesn't say to us what the 13 brises are as enumerated by the Rambam. The Mishnah just says there are 13. The Rambam details them. Now, the reason for these changes is understood because the Rambam needs to articulate more the Mishnah. He quotes the Mishnah, but he explains it. Afal pi adosis verstandig, even though that's understood. Rambam is as it is maitik loshna Mishnah chulu. The rules of the Rambam is that he quotes the language of the Mishnah, etc. The other things that he brings down, he will quote it. Unal Sefer from halachas, since the Rambam is a book which tells us the halachas, is a kama pa'amim. So many times, moisif umevayer, he adds and he articulates bilshein hamishna onto the language of the Mishnah, kidei the halacha zolaros kumen muzbaru borur, so that this law should come out very clear, explained and clear. So, adding Avram Avinu and detailing the Yud Gimel Brisos, it's understood as halachas, he needs to clarify and articulate and specify. But here the Rebbe says, "Von deswegen fotzet sich biur beniten the dam," we require explanation in our place. The Rebbe is going to question that the details of the 13 covenants is different between the way it's quoted in the Rambam and the way the 13 covenants are articulated in Yerushalmi. In the Mishnah, as mentioned, there is no details. It just says there are 13 covenants. But exactly what are the 13 covenants? So there's a difference. If you count in the Pasuk, in the Psukim from where the Eibishter is telling Avram, which starts in that Pasuk until the end of the Parsha, there are 13 covenants over there. So in the Parsha of Milah, there's 13 covenants, but there is also a covenant that the Eibishter talked to Avram in the Bris Bein Absorim. He made a covenant when he had him go through the pieces the whole process over there, that was also a covenant. It wasn't a covenant of a bris milah, it was a covenant, nevertheless, over there. So when the Rambam mentions, he talks about all the covenants that are by a bris milah, like he says in Avram Avinu, but and and by the bris milah, that's what he mentions. But in the Yerushalmi, which is the quote of the Rambam, over there he brings down also the covenant of the bris ben absonim, which is not the milah covenant, but the chlala covenant. And then we have an issue. If we count the bris of before, then we have 14. This is going to be the discussion over here. And how do we reconcile the Rambam with the Yerushalmi, and what's the pshat in Yerushalmi? Let's look inside. The Mokeriv Divrei HaRambam, the source for the words of the Rambam, that first of all he says, Oif im Avram Avinu, that it was with Avram, our father. Und auf dem Pirut von Yud Gimel Brisis, and also the details of the 13 covenants which the Rambam added over the Mishnah, is Lecha Yerushalmi Nedorim. That's would seem that is from the Yerushalmi in Nedorim. Over there it says the Maimer von Rabbi Yochanan. Over there is the statement of not the Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan Bar Moreh. So he says like this. He says, "Ksiv Bayoim Ahu Koras Hashem Brises Avram." He's talking about the pasuk Ben Absorim, the earlier pasuk. That day Hashem formed a covenant with Avram, which is in Perik Tezvav pasuk Yudches earlier, and he quotes as the first lamer, and then he brings down Ad ve'es brisi okim es Yitzchok till the end of the pasuk, in which he says as brisi okim es Yitzchok. That's the details in the Yerushalmi. Okay, so the Rambam, when he quotes it, he quotes the 13 only by the bris milah, not the one from before. But that's if the source is the Yerushalmi, why does he change from the Yerushalmi? We need to understand, Favos is the Rambam mashmit dem ersten pasuk. Why is the Rambam omitting the first pasuk was the Yerushalmi bringt? The first pasuk that he brings, the Yerushalmi brings the very first pasuk by Yoim Ahu Koras Hashem es Avram Bris Leimer Gomer, which Hashem formed with him the covenant to say. That's the very first pasuk about the Chlal, the covenant of Avram. Befrat, as their pasuk state in the Parsha Friya. That's the first one. The Rambam is only starting with the psukim over here by Bris Milah, and that's even beforehand. Why isn't the Rambam counted? So it seems almost obvious that the Rambam doesn't count it because it's not part of the bris covenants, and the Rambam holds that we're only counting the covenants that are formed over here. That pasuk is talking about with Avram Avinu and not connected. But the Rebbe wants to know, but how could the Yerushalmi count it then? And then what's we're going to do with the extra pasuk according to the Yerushalmi? If it then should be 14. Let's look inside. Base. Bepashtus, simply, the Rambam rechentois Yud Gimel Brisis in Parsha on the pasuk by Yom Gomer. He has 13 times that it says bris in the Parsha itself, without needing the verse of Bayom Ahu that speaks about before in the bris ben Abesorim. Without that bris, he already has 13 just in the Parsha of Bris Milah. Is move on, so it's understood. As er halt, as the pasuk is nid b'chlolam, he holds that pasuk Or Bayemahu Kores as Abram is something different. That's not included. Vahatam. Why is it not included? It's also obvious. Is with the Rambam is mefarish in Pirush HaMishnayis. The Rambam explains, I said obvious, but the Rebbe says, as the Rambam himself says in the Pirush HaMishnayis, the Yud Gimel Brises, in the Pirush HaMishnayis says, Hey Milas Bris, Ubrisi. Those are the words when it says the word bris, a brisi, hanichpolim, that are duplicated. The mitzvahs Hashem Yisrael, Hashem Yisbarach LaAvram Avinu, they were duplicated in the command when the blessed Hashem said to Avram Avinu, Bivris Milah. He says specifically the 13 times bris that were duplicated at the time, mentioned at the time of the bris milah, b'maimed echad b'fnei atzmei, in one setting by itself. At that same time, the Eibishter said again and again, bris, bris, bris. That's the 13 brises. This is only the ones that the Rambam details. Those are the 13 brises that is mentioned in the pasuk. Mashen came their posik by Yoimahu Koros Hashem Esabarom Bris Leimer. The posik that at that day Hashem for the covenant, it's another covenant. It's two things. Red wegen Abris. First, it's talking about a covenant. All of us is nit given b'maimed echad. It's not during the same time with the andere brises. It's not at the time that the brises of the covenant of Milah. It's at a different time. Not only is it different, it was many years before. No, Nochmer is given behefse kama v'kama shonim. There are many years in between the bris over there and the bris by the bris milah, so it's not b'may medecha. So number one, un beis was is nit given b'shaychus with bris milah, and number two, that bris wasn't connected with the circumcision, nor bris bein absorim of nisinas oretz. That was a covenant that they were going to get the land, Lazarish shel Avram, to the seed of Avram. But it's not part of the bris to Avram. Okay, so why the Rambam deviates from the Yerushalmi? Because the Rambam explains in Pirush HaMishnayis that it's all the brisin that are said at one point. And with regards to the bris milah, with the covenant for the circumcision, that's another covenant. That's a covenant that has to do that the land is going to given to the seed of Abraham. Okay, that's such a good argument. So now we have to understand why is the Rambam actually including it. Aber lifizeh is not moving the idach. But then we don't understand on the other hand. Farvos der Yerushalmi bringt dem posik. Why would the Rabbi Chaim bring that pasuk by Yemahu Koros Habayi V'Goyim that Hashem did for him on that day, when this pasuk is really something different? And as we'll see later on, the Rebbe's Chiddush, the Rebbe explains that there is a general idea of a covenant which would include all covenants, and then there is the specific bris milah, as the Rebbe will explain later on. But Nochmer Tmiya. The Rebbe says it's even more surprising over here on the Yerushalmi, since you're counting also the Yerushalmi, the first pasuk, the previous Bris Ben Absorim, as one of the 13 covenants, because Yerushalmi is explaining the Mishnah that says there's 13. So it turns out we have 14, because 13 in the psukim itself of bris milah. Then we have Vayemu Koros. So how could the Yerushalmi start with the pasuk Vayemu Koros, and then you end up with 14? Nochmer Tmiya. It's even more surprising. Der Maimer Yerushalmi kommt masber sein. This saying of the Yerushalmi is coming to explain was the Mishnah zogt, is explaining the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, as if Milah nichlusu shloish esrei brisos, that on the circumcision there are 13 covenants. Wie es wird ausgeführt in der Maimer Hanal Yerushalmi, Shloish Esrei Brisis. So that's explaining the Mishnah that says 13. And when the Yerushalmi counts it out, he says at the end, in the statement of the Yerushalmi, Shloish Esrei Brisis. So it's definitely the number 13. But how do we get 13 if we have an extra pasuk? If we're also going to be counting the pasuk by Yom Hashem Koras Avram in Bris Ben Abisorim, that Bris, then it comes out that there is actually 14 brises, not 13. So how do we explain the Yerushalmi that starts off with the pasuk by Yom Koras Havai? It seems to have 14 brises. So at the end of the day, the Rebbe clarifies in those bays, while the Rambam we understand, but we don't understand the Yerushalmi. Why is he bringing in a bris which is not at the connection to the bris milah? But more importantly, now it turns out that it's 14, not 13. So the Rebbe brings there's different answers that is given on that. But the Rebbe brings down different answers over here, but the Rebbe doesn't really. The Rebbe wants to explain that there's different approaches between the Babli and the Yerushalmi, as the Rebbe explains. But first, the Rebbe brings down several of the answers that are brought down. Gimel. In Meforshim Zainen Do, of them. In the commentators, there are several answers to this question. First of all, they're fixing up the version in the Yerushalmi. They're saying that in the Yerushalmi, it's an error that it says the pasuk v'yom koros sabris. It doesn't have to say. We have to say the pasuk like in the Rambam ve'et no brisi, which is the first pasuk, and not the previous pasuk. So you only have 13. So the Rambam fits with the Yerushalmi fits with how the Rambam says. It's just a different version in the Yerushalmi. But the Rebbe argues that there is Rishonim that bring down. This is not sort of can't say that it's just a version because it's quoted elsewhere in this way that we bring down by Yemahu Koras also. Gimel in the Farshim Zayne Do Kamet Terutzim of them. In the Farshim there are several answers on this Yerushalmi. Aleph Oich in Yerushalmi Darstein. They say that also in Yerushalmi the way he needs to say Nid der Pasuk by Yemahu Koras Gomer shouldn't be saying the Pasuk by Yemahu Koras. Nor the pasuk vet nabrisi, which is brought down in the beginning of the milah. That would be the 13 of milah. With the Rambam Rechem, just as the Rambam Nuretz. But the Rebbe says that's difficult to say because Megifin Tober in Rishonim, we find in the earlier commentators, Azei Zainem Maitik from Yerushalmi Gisa Hanal, that they are quoting from the Yerushalmi, the above version, as it's written, that the pasuk is by Yemu Koras. As the pasuk by Yemu Koras wird gebracht, als einer und erste von die Yid Gimel Christus. For the Yid Gimel Brisses. That's one of the Brissa. Uli Pirusha. And the way they explain it, these Rishonim explain, and to them, this is the point. So, it's a difficult answer to say that the version of the Yerushalmi is not correct. It's supposed to be with different because the Rishonim quoted and their commentary is such. So we have to explain the Yerushalmi as is. Base, there's another answer. The Dasa Yerushalmi rechet mit nit eine von die andere L'shoine shel Bris verstehen be Parshas Milah. In the Rishalmi's view, the reason we have only 13, because one of the languages of Bris that are written in Parshas Milah, we don't count. As the Rebbe brings down, the Posik, it says in the verse, as Brisi Heifar, either they don't say that my covenant he has undone. So it's not talking about a covenant, it's talking about undone. So they say we can't count that. Or the merechen dem posik, or when the posik says vakimoisi as brisi itoy, the bris oilam, these are not two. I will form a covenant with him. The bris oilam says two times brisi, bris, but it's still only one. I'll say in bris. This is another commentary. This is in the I'll go on the Meiri. This is another. Nit with the Rambos was rechen say for zwei brises, unlike the Rambam, which counts them for two brises. So if we should assume that, this interpretation, as the Rambam is mechulik midas HaYerushalmi. So I would say the Rambam disagrees with the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi has different 13 psukim than the psukim of the Yerushalmi. And Yerushalmi have different 13 psukim. The Yerushalmi omits one of the 13 that the Rambam counts, and therefore he brings in the Bris Ben Absorim, Akimoisis Brisi, not Akimoisis Brisi, the Bris Ben Absorim, and the Rambam has 13 within the Bris Milah itself. So that would mean there's two differences of opinions between the Rambam and the Yerushalmi. But since the Rambam doesn't have another source but the Yerushalmi, it's hard to explain that the Rambam disagrees with the Yerushalmi here. How could the Rambam go against the Yerushalmi when there's no other source to support the Rambam's detail? So it's more reasonable to try to find a way that the Rambam and the Yerushalmi don't disagree, but they're talking about two separate areas, and there's no contradiction, as the Rebbe, that's the Rebbe's Chiddush going to be in the Sicha. Aber azoi wollt man gekannt sagen, this is, we would say, when es wollt given am Moker, my Mechazal, when we had a source, a saying of our sage's blessed memory, as the Yud Gimel Brisus werden gerechnet be'esem zu Divrei Rambam, that the 13 covenants are counted as they're fitting to the words of the Rambam. The Baal Dober as Mikifintas Nit, since we don't find it. When the einzige Moker is the Yerushalmi Hanan, the only source is that above Yerushalmi. Because in the Bavli just says 13, so we don't have a source. So the only source is the Yerushalmi. The Bavli is Soisim and is Nit Mefarit. The Bavli closes up, it doesn't articulate. Welche sein in the Yud Gimel Brises, which are the 13 covenants. So v'yesh loymar, and the Rebbe says the reason why he doesn't, as there is sich soymach of Yerushalmi shekod bizman la Bavli. Maybe the Bavli was relying on the Yerushalmi, which was earlier than the Bavli, so he was relying on the 13 of the Yerushalmi. The Rebbe doesn't want to get involved that the Bavli can rely on the Yerushalmi, because that's probably would take a big chiddush to say that the Bavli relies on the Yerushalmi. So ain't right now is not the time. But whatever the case is, we don't have an articulation how to count the 13 in the Bavli, and the only thing we have is the Yerushalmi. Why would the Rambam disagree? How could the Rambam? How could he disagree on a Yerushalmi which enumerates differently than him? Is mistaber, therefore it's logical, as the Yerushalmi and the Rambam, that the Yerushalmi and the Rambam is as nit taplukte beinehem. It's not that there is an argument amongst them, nor al derech mar omar chodom mar omar chodom lepligi. But this is similar to when we say this one says one thing, and the other one says one thing, and they don't really disagree. The Yerushalmi, in his counting for 13, is talking about one situation. The Rambam counting the 13 is talking about a other situation, and therefore they're not contradictory, but they're actually talking in different areas, as the Rebbe will explain later on in the Sicha. So, in order to understand the question, the Rambam, and actually the Yerushalmi, and the Rambam switches off and says it different than the Yerushalmi. What's the explanation over here? So before we explain that, the Rebbe points